Mabuhay and welcome back to the channel. My name is Tez Milan. I am a Filipino-American creative. Today I'd like to talk to you about Larry the musical. Who is Larry? Who is this musical about? I had the privilege of watching the premiere opening night that happened this past weekend in San Francisco. It is a big day for Filipino-Americans. This is a long time in the making to tell this story. I was the honored guest of Manang Elena, who I got to interview when I went to Stockton, California, when I started my journey with Filipino-American creative. When I went to go interview her at Little Manila Rising, I remember walking into their office and seeing a photograph of a very good-looking, strong, determined Filipino. And I was thinking to myself, who is this guy? And I think during that interview, they pointed him out and said, oh yeah, by the way, that's Larry Itliong. And I was like, who is Larry? And now a year and a half later, I have heard so many stories about this man. I've heard how he has inspired so many Filipinos. And there are so many people who are trying to get his story out there, mainly because he was so pivotal and so important to American history. Everybody knows about Cesar Chavez. Not many people know about Larry Itliong and how he was pivotal to the farm labor movement and pivotal to what is known as the Delano grape strike. And nobody knows about that. He's not taught about in school. He's not taught about in American history. Every time I tell people about Larry, they're like, who's Larry? And these are Filipinos, Filipino-Americans. Many people don't know about him. Now there are things like this musical that are out there telling his story and telling about how important he is. So here's some of the things that I learned about Larry during the musical that I got to watch over the weekend. Larry came to the United States from the Philippines, I believe in the year 1929. He's from a province called Pangasinan. As far as I understand, he didn't necessarily go to law school, but he taught himself the law. And when he came to the United States, he essentially wanted to become a lawyer. I believe he could speak 7 different languages and dialects. He wanted to use his skills to be able to protect people and to defend people. And during the time that he came to the US, there was also a lot of prejudice and racism that was happening, specifically towards Filipinos. Whether that had anything to do with the fact that he was Filipino or just the fact that he was an immigrant and a person of color, that opportunity to become a lawyer in the US was not available to him. So what did he end up doing instead? He ended up working on the farms and working together with a lot of migrant farmers that would go between Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, all the way up to Alaska to work the canneries there. When he was in Alaska, he got into an accident and lost several fingers. And so that's why one of his nicknames is 7 Fingers. There's actually a song in the musical where they talk about his 7 fingers. So he worked closely with a lot of Filipino immigrants and a lot of immigrants of other nations and other countries, getting to know their stories, getting to know their struggles, getting to know what it is that they hoped for and dreamed for. They needed somebody to help them organize and to be able to have a voice to tell the farm growers, hey, for the back-breaking work that we're doing, we deserve to be paid better. We deserve a better work environment. Because of that, he started to become a prominent leader, specifically for organizing and for giving them a voice when they felt like they weren't being treated well, when they felt like they weren't being paid enough. And so Larry became a labor organizer and a labor leader. The prejudice against Filipinos at the time was so bad that there were places in the United States where they had physical signs that said no Filipinos allowed. That racism and prejudice against Filipinos in particular ended up culminating in several riots where I believe a Filipino was shot and killed. There was also bombings that took place. There was just a lot of tension between the general public against Filipinos. And so that's why somebody like Larry, why his story is so remarkable is because in the face of all of this prejudice, racism, and danger, he still rose up as a leader and still put himself out there to help Filipinos organize. He traveled between Alaska, as I shared. He was also in Seattle. He was in Stockton. He went all the way to Coachella and was pivotal to some strikes that happened around that area. And on the heels of that success, he was then brought to Delano to help organize there. And that is where he came into contact with Cesar Chavez. Now, what's interesting is that during the musical, they don't really focus a lot on Cesar. Actually, I don't even think that they have a person playing Cesar. What's really interesting about the relationship between Larry and Cesar is that Cesar is known to have a more, I don't want to say passive approach, but he was just gentler in his approach. Larry was known to be more aggressive and going forth and striking and doing all of these things. There was a difference in their approaches. Because of that, when it came to the pivotal point of where it became clear that they needed to strike, Cesar Chavez actually did not want to strike. He was kind of against it. He was like, that's not going to get us to the goal that we want. And Larry was like, well, I beg to differ, and I think that we should strike. Because what was happening is that whenever a group, a community would strike and stop working, the farm growers, they would go to another community, for example, the Chicano community or the Mexican community, and say, okay, look, we have this work available. Do you want to come and work? And so they would pit different communities against each other. So if one would strike, then they would just go off and hire another community, and then they would work. And then when that community decided that they'd had enough and they wanted to strike, then they'd go back and hire the Filipinos. And so it was this back and forth where people would strike, but it would never move the needle in terms of getting the results that they wanted, getting a better wage, getting better working conditions. Larry got the Filipinos at a pivotal time, basically at the peak of harvest. They went into the grape field, they cut the grapes off of the vine, and instead of taking them and, harvesting them properly, the way that they did the strike is that they cut the grapes off the vine and then put them on the ground and then walked off of the field. Larry went to Cesar and said, look, we're going to strike, and I would like for us to strike together. That is what is so remarkable about Larry Itliong, is that he not only organized the Filipinos to strike, but he also went to Cesar Chavez and to Dolores Huerta and said, look, we need to do this together. Together we are stronger. In solidarity, we are stronger if we strike together, instead of one of us striking and then the other going to work and then you striking and then us going to work. Like, all of us should strike. And that essentially started the Delano grape strike. So that's what Larry did, is that he got all of these communities to come together, all of the communities to strike together so that they could finally have a unified voice and say, you can't pit us against each other. We are doing this together and you need to listen to us. That's what's not taught in schools today, is the fact that a Filipino was pivotal to this movement. So much is said about Cesar Chavez, so much is said about Dolores Huerta. There's stories about reasons why that is, but the fact is that Larry is not talked about in history. And that's why this musical is so important to our community, and it is a point of pride for us, not only because we're telling the story, but because also the creatives who created this story are all Filipino. The creatives who are telling this story are all Filipino. The producers, everybody from soup to nuts, from beginning to end of the creation of this musical, are all Filipino. And what's also interesting is that it took 5 years for this musical to finally come about. And so it's just really exciting to see that this is there for people to learn about Larry, and for young people to see that there is somebody amongst us, somebody in our community who rose up and had a voice and spoke for the people that he spoke for the voiceless, essentially. It's just so remarkable and awe-inspiring to see that somebody like this existed, and somebody like this was so pivotal to American history, and that he's Filipino and came from the Philippines. One of the most important things to know about Larry the Musical, beyond the history that it teaches us and the history that it shows us, is that it doesn't just talk about Larry, it talks about other Filipinos who were a part of his story. It shows that Larry's story is not just Larry's story is our story. And what I mean by our story is that essentially we're all immigrants to this country, except for those who had always been here, of course. But the struggles that they go through collectively, the sacrifices that they made, they're all a part of us. My parents made similar sacrifices. My parents also experienced disappointments and surprises along the journey. We all come here to this country with the American dream, with a goal in mind, with things that we want to do and achieve. And oftentimes that path is not straight. That path is curvy, and that path ends up in places that we don't expect it to. Very similar to Larry's story. You know, he expected certain things to happen regarding the labor movement and the changes that took place. And then he ended up leaving the very same organization that he helped create together with Cesar Chavez for his own personal reasons. And that oftentimes happens to immigrants. You know, it's like you have a goal, you have something in mind that you want to achieve, and sometimes you achieve something vastly different and even more profound, just like with Larry. Larry passed away in the 70s from Lou Gehrig's disease. And I don't think that he had any clue the kind of impact that he has had on our community today. Like 50 years later, we are finally talking about him and finally talking about his story and finally gaining inspiration from what it is that he did. Because of his example, I feel more courageous to have a voice, to speak my mind, to share my story. And I know that I'm not the only one. I know that there are so many people who have been affected by his example and are taking a stand for themselves and for what they believe is for the betterment of the community. All thanks to Larry. And now this musical is an example of that, an iteration of what it is that he did for us and for our communities. That's what I had to share with you today. I hope you enjoyed my little recap of what it is that I learned from Larry the Musical. And if you get a chance, please go see it. There are talks about the musical possibly going on tour and being shown elsewhere. I really hope that this story gets shared, and I highly, highly recommend seeing it. It's a beautiful piece. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you so much. Paalam. Goodbye.